Hey everyone, this is Brian from the Tennis IQ podcast. Josh and I hope that you're enjoying the content and discussions that we put out week after week. If you would like to support the podcast and help us to continue to produce quality episodes, visit our Patreon page at patreon.com/tennisiqpodcast/membership. Currently, we have two tiers of support, $3 per month and $7 per month. So again, our Patreon page is patreon.com/tennisiqpodcast/membership. Thank you so much. And now, on to the show. Hello and welcome to the Tennis IQ podcast. I'm Brian Lomax.
And I'm Josh Berger. And in today's episode, we are going to discuss some of the differences between pro players and club players. And obviously, there are quite a few differences. There's a reason why, of the many millions of people that play tennis around the world, only a select few are professional players, and among them, an even smaller number, much smaller number, play at the elite professional level, where they're playing in Grand Slam tournaments and playing on TV, and have many people knowing who they are and following their matches and that sort of thing. And I think today we're going to talk from a few different angles about what some of these differences are and whether it makes sense for club players to emulate, to copy, to pattern their games, their mental games, some of these things off of pro players. Because I know we've talked a lot on this show about we often reference pro players often as examples, or as as reasons why they're successful, right? Reasons why certain top players in the world are successful. And we cite the mental game for different reasons, whether it's the in-between point routine, whether it's resilience, whether it's that belief, that self-belief, even when you're down match point, right? And we've mentioned whether it's Iga Swiatek and her commitment to the mental game, or Nadal and Djokovic or Serena, all these, we've mentioned Federer, we've mentioned many top players, and how their commitment to the mental game has helped them get to where they are. And just, we've talked about strengths and weaknesses that they've had in many episodes. So we've had at this point a few different people reach out to us. And again, if you ever want to reach out, you can always reach out via email at tennisiqpodcast@gmail.com, just as a reminder. We've had a few people reach out talking to us about, club players and how how are things different from a mental perspective for club players compared to the pros, compared to the types of people that are able to dedicate their lives to the sport and train for many hours a day and have a team around them. If we compare them to everybody else, right? The people that play a few times a week, the people that are passionate about the sport, the people who make up the vast majority of our audience, and the vast majority of tennis players globally. So that's really what we're going to dive into today, I think, from a few different angles.
Yeah, and I think it's an interesting question because, when I think at least of the mental game, Josh, you mentioned that we look at some of the pros as like exemplars of certain types of behavior, but not all of them are exemplars of all behaviors. So we might pick someone like a Novak Djokovic for his use of visualization as a mental preparation tool. We may look at Rafael Nadal for how he manages his time between points, or Maria Sharapova. We might look at someone else in terms of how they handle the pressure of a big moment. We've talked a lot about Carlos Alcaraz and his ability, his self-belief. So there are, I think, a lot of different exemplars that we may use to show how to do certain things. We may not always use the same person for every single thing. And so I think that's part of why we watch the pros, is because they are examples, and we're all trying to discover what works best for us. Can't, there's like no, I would say there's no like right way to do something. Now there are many like good ways to do things, and then there are many ways in which you'll have a ceiling on your potential. And so we're all trying to discover those better ways for us to do it. And when we watch the pros play and we watch how they act on the court and we watch their professionalism, we can say, all right, I want to emulate that because it at least gives me a foundation to start with. And from there, I gain some experience trying this thing, and I'm able to synthesize that a little bit, see how that goes, and I may then make some adjustments after trying that for a little while. So I think in one way they serve as a good basis for you starting to create your own recipe for your mental game, your maybe your technical game, and other levels of professionalism. So I think it makes sense, and of course there are differences between sort of the club level and the professional level. In all areas of training. You know, technically maybe not as strong, physically perhaps not as strong. Certainly don't have the same amount of time to put into that, most likely. Unless you're a junior player, but you may be working on that same schedule as a pro, but you probably also have to go to school. Because we have to remember the pros, this is their job. So I think when you look at all these levels, there is a difference between being a professional at something and not. And it's not just the money always. Sometimes it's just going pro in your mind, being as professional as you can. But we don't all have the resources, we don't all have the time to do that. So when it comes to when to copy the pros and when not to, I think there are some examples of things we wouldn't copy from the pros. Many are technical, some could be decision making, some could be how they handle things between points or on changeovers. But when I suggest to someone that they watch a pro, it's because I have seen something really good from this player. And I think it will be good for the player I'm working with to take a look at that and to see how you might integrate that little bit into your game. Before we were kind of jumped on here, we were talking about all these people are human. So they're not 100% perfect. They will occasionally have their own issues mentally, maybe a meltdown, or do something, or make bad decisions in points and in matches. So if, say, I suggest a certain player to watch for the between point routine, the idea of the player receiving that message from me shouldn't be, well, so-and-so does this and I don't like that. We can always find sort of the 5 to 10% that's not good. And when we suggest that you watch a pro, we're really looking at that 80 to 90% of what they do is really good, but recognizing that they're not perfect. So I think that there are a lot of pros that we can look at that could help club players. Of course, club players are even different in their mental game, but if we break it down into the components that we're trying to build with them, your ability to relax, focus, to develop your confidence, to have good positive intrinsic motivation, and some other motivational factors, intensity, all those little things that go into it. We're building that maybe at a more base level. But to be honest, I've worked with some players who are playing some pro tournaments, and we started at the same level, essentially, because mental training and sports psychology coaching hasn't been so prevalent everywhere in the world that many of these players, they've gotten to where they are with fantastic work ethic. They've had some talent that they've turned into a lot of skill. But if they haven't received any formal mental training, we're starting at the same place as if your UTR is a 7 or a 6, or your NTRP is a 4 or a 3.5 or a 3.0, whatever. And so in that regard, it's a lot of the same stuff. I would imagine that you found the same, Josh.
Absolutely. No, I think that's absolutely the case where whether whether it's a player who is at that professional level or it's maybe a junior player who's 12, 13, 15 and has aspirations of getting to that level and is training and working towards those sorts of goals. I most people who haven't had experience with mental training don't necessarily have that foundation. Yes, there are some coaches that talk about the mental game, maybe have done some training and learned more about the mental game and incorporate that into their coaching, but I definitely don't wouldn't say it's the norm. So I think yeah, regardless of a player's level on the court, if they haven't dedicated themselves to the mental game and mental skills in that same way, their development can certainly lag behind. And I think we even see it at the professional level, right? I mean, you know, Nick Kyrgios as an example. First of all, he doesn't have a coach right now, and he hasn't for a while. But I mean, I think his mental game and I think you see him in between points and he's chirping, right? He's talking to the umpire and he's upset about something that happened 3 games ago, or he's upset at the people in his box, right? His own family and supporters for not cheering loud enough for him. And, I think it's a pretty clear indication, or at least one of the main indications, why he's not ranked higher. And I think I even have a couple friends who aren't the biggest of tennis fans that have started getting into the sport more and enjoy watching him. And I think most people probably enjoy watching him play, myself included. But I think you bring up that 5 or 10% that a player doesn't do, and I think for someone like him or someone like a Fabio Fognini, or I think there are other examples. You know, you see players at the top of the game who have all the ability, who it looks like they should be there's no reason why they can't be the top player or among the top players in the world. And I think there's a couple big things holding them back, whether it's that week in, week out consistency that we see from the top guys. I think that's a huge part of it. That commitment level too, and then also just that commitment to handling those ups and downs that'll come, that of winning points and losing points and breaking and being broken and being able to sort of ride those waves and those ups and downs. And, I think that ultimately, just like it can be the difference maker at the 3-5, 4-0 level, at the club level, or at the 12s, 14s, 16s, 18s level, among players of a certain USTA section, let's just say, it can also be the difference maker at the pro level. So I think it can make sense to make comparisons, and to talk to junior players, adult club players, and refer to top pros, because I think in a certain way it humanizes club players and junior players when they make mistakes, right? Okay, you had an outburst or you weren't fully present, and don't be too hard on yourself, because even the top players in the world go through that sometimes too. Does it happen to them less? Yes, definitely. There's a reason why they are where they are, but it does happen to them. But at that same time, let's not let your mental game hold you back in that same way that it holds them back, right? The difference between a Kyrgios being ranked what he is and having won maybe multiple Grand Slams at this point, but also understanding, okay, probably most club players still at this point aren't doing mental training, or certainly aren't doing enough of it. So this is a way to professionalize your training, to make at least this one aspect of your game closer to the professional level, to its highest capabilities, and to get an edge on your competition.
Right. And I think professionalism is a good word. Not that many of us are going to go professional for real. Like, we're not going to start entering, 15K, 25K, and ATP and WTA events. But that doesn't mean you can't be more professional in how you approach what you're doing. The author Stephen Pressfield talks about the difference between a professional and an amateur, and he notes that amateur in Latin means someone who does something for the love of it, right? We often think as the amateur does it for the love of the game. He retorts with that and basically says, well, if you really love something, why wouldn't you be more professional about it. And so that's really one way to start to look at this is, all right, we want to be better in our games. Okay, let's just be a little bit more professional. Now, you may not be able to do that in all aspects of your game. So, the easiest thing to do is start looking at what you see on TV and picking out a player maybe you want to emulate in terms of their between point routine or what they do on changeovers. So, some of the people I suggest, I love Victoria Azarenka, what she does on between points and what she does on changeovers. So she's very structured between points. She's looking at the strings. She takes her time. She has great body language all the time. You can see her pumping herself up. I think she's a wonderful example for both men and women to observe. And on the changeover, I think this has maybe evolved over time, but she tends to be almost looks meditative oftentimes with her eyes closed. Maybe she's visualizing, maybe she's meditating, but she's really calming herself down. The eyes closed is great. Maybe she needs that because some of us, when we see things, we get overly focused on what we see. So she's doing a really good job there of managing what she looks at. A lot of pros do that with looking at the strings or looking at the ground. So there are a lot of things that people could copy there. Maybe you feel like you could do a better job preparing. Now, that's the stuff we don't necessarily see, but you can certainly read about it and study that. Maybe it could be about recovery. Many players, not that everybody wants to do this, it doesn't sound exactly pleasurable, but ice baths afterwards. Or, how are you recovering from these things? There are many elements that I think we could look at the best players in the world and even maybe the best athletes in the world in terms of how they do these things and just bring a little bit more professionalism. We don't need to go from, let's say we're on a 0 to 100 scale and my pre-match routine is maybe a 20. Well, we don't need you to be a 90 next week. Let's just make some improvements on 20. Can we get to 25 or 30? And just do a couple little things and begin to add on. Because you may not be able to do all that little extra stuff. So I think using great athletes, using great competitors as examples, and picking ones that you maybe even resonate with their personality, that you like, and studying them a little bit more. Just even the fact that you're studying is a way of being more professional about what you're doing. So I do think there's a lot of good stuff to study. I think between points is good. Changeover stuff is good. Body language in general, as you mentioned, Josh. How do you handle the winning and losing of points of games? How do you open a set? We had one of our earlier episodes was like on stages of a set. How do professional players handle the beginning of a set, the middle it's tied, or they're down a break or up a break? There are a lot of things to learn from that. Of course, with some players, there are things that you probably don't want to copy. You mentioned, Nick and what he's doing. What he does between points is, I guess it's a little bit more self-limiting, unfortunately, for him. But as we've said in some past episodes, he is getting a little bit better all the time. Will he be able to get over that hurdle? I don't know. Hopefully, he will. But not every player is somebody to copy. I wouldn't, for example, I don't use Federer as an exemplar of what to do between points because he's too inconsistent there. Now, it works for him because he's an elite level player and he's clearly developed elite level focus that he can switch back on and off pretty quickly. Other players are more structured. I think that's a better place to start. So I wouldn't use him as an example there. So similarly, I might not use some other players as examples of different things. But you can find a lot of goodness in seeing all of these pros and picking out little things to use and just either yourself or you're working with a coach to help improve your game. That's not just the on-court piece, the technical stuff. I think if you make a little improvement in preparation or what you do between points or strength and conditioning, you will see on-court impacts. And these are some of the things that professional players are doing that doesn't necessarily get a lot of press or a lot of exposure, but they're doing it. And there's a lot of value for club players or junior players to understand how they do that. It's not just all the technical stuff and just the physical stuff that goes on the court.
Definitely, definitely. I think there's a lot that we don't see with them. I mean, you mentioned, this is their full-time job, right? So they have the time in their day to dedicate to training many hours a day and strength and conditioning and the recovery piece and whatever else, right? Taking their nutrition as seriously as they can and all of
Sleep.
these pieces.
Yeah.
Sleep, absolutely. Um, I think when it comes to being a student of the game and watching players play more, I think, watching top players and, just watching the professional game more, I think, yeah, as you mentioned, trying to focus on one key element of a player, right? Like, for instance, maybe it's a player's in between point routine, or maybe you're picking a player and you're watching their footwork and just noticing how, with most pro players, their feet never stop moving. There's never a time where they just stop. And most club players do. Most club players, and myself included, I certainly don't always have the best footwork, for people that have played with me. But I think many club players stop moving their feet, and I think that's a big one. Also, decision making, and I think that's an important one because if you watch if you watch most pros, you'll start to see how consistent they really are, how consistent they can be. Doesn't mean that they don't play aggressively, no, and in fact, most, as we've talked about in the past, most points at the pro level tend to be pretty short, 4 shots or less the majority of the time. But they all have the ability to play consistently. Even guys that maybe we would think of as ultra aggressive players have the ability to grind it out in long rallies as needed. And they're not most of the time going for really low percentage shots. Are there exceptions? Yes. Carlos Alcaraz actually could be a bit of an exception. I think there are moments where he goes for relatively low percentage shots, and guess what? He gets away with it because he is at the level that he is currently the number one ranked men's player in the world. But is that for the 3-5 to 3-5, 3-0, whatever, 4-0, 4-5 player? Would I recommend going for shots, going for winners behind the baseline the way he does, or hitting? I think back to that incredible shot he hit against Francis Tiafoe, where he was at the net and Tiafoe lobbed him, and he turned around and hit this incredible forehand pass. But in general, he tends to go for riskier shots and is able to pull it off oftentimes because of his ability. So, when it comes to decision making, noticing how often so many of the top players are keeping the ball cross court, playing over the higher part of the net, hitting with margin. I mean, I think Djokovic is a prime example of that. I think, I think you can look at a lot of top players, maybe a David Ferrer, for instance, as a player who would always, play with more margin, play maybe a little bit safer, or maybe a Diego Schwartzman, and maybe with both of those guys, they had to, but they also embodied, a lot of just consistency and reliability in their shots. But I think noticing noticing how consistent players can be. I actually just recently, and I know I've said a lot here, so definitely wanted to hear what you have to say, Brian. Just wanted to add one more thing. I just saw a video. I think it just came out maybe a couple days ago from Patrick Mouratoglou, a video that he recorded at his academy, and there were two younger players that he was with, and they played I think like sort of a tiebreak. They played, just feed the ball in and play the point out to 11 type of thing. And afterwards, he was talking to one of them and saying, talking about consistency and saying that the level that we see from pros, and the type of shots that they go for in matches are, they all practice and train in a way where they can hit these shots over and over and over again. And then they look for the chance to be aggressive, but they're not regularly going for shots that are low percentage or shots that they can't reliably make most of the time. And I think sometimes we watch the pros and they have 3 shot rallies, 5 shot rallies, big serve, big forehand, point over, and we think, okay, I have to play in this ultra aggressive way because that's what the best in the world do. When in reality, they're able to play very consistently, and they often do. Sometimes they have to bring it to that next level and go for it more in order to take control of the point, or at that level, their opponent takes it from them. So we can link to that video because I think it's an interesting perspective. There's the first half to 2/3 of the video is a lot of just points, clay court points at Patrick's Academy, but I think the conversation towards the end was important because it just shows how important consistency is, and I think that's all tied in with decision making. So, I think there definitely are some great examples of players you can watch that and learn from in that way, but also just understanding if a pro is going for a certain shot, that likely doesn't make sense for you to go for that type of shot because you're not them. You don't have that ability. You can't, maybe Alcaraz can make a certain shot 40% of the time. And when he's behind in the point, it makes sense for him to go for that shot because he could hit a winner 40% of the time and miss it 60% of the time, but he's behind in the points, so he goes for it. For everybody else who doesn't have a world ranking, who's a club level player or junior level player, you're not at 40%. You're at a lot lower than that. So it probably doesn't make sense for you to go for that. So I think I know that was a little bit of a drawn out point, but I think when it comes to decision making, that's an area that's definitely different. Definitely some key differences there, but also I think there's a lot to learn from the pros in that area.
Yeah, for sure. And I think if you're trying to develop decision making, it's really about, and again, about your game. What's the right shot from this spot in the court at this time? And the more you understand the geometry of the court and what the high percentage shots are and what your capabilities are within that, then you can make better decisions about, all right, am I in a position where I can be aggressive? So, that would typically be a little bit more inside the baseline, might be some place, right? You'll be able to be more accurate with the ball because you're hitting to a shorter distance. You can see your target a little bit better versus, behind the baseline, where, of course, you'll find top pros who are able to do that. But there's a higher risk, and with the more risk that you have, the more likely your errors are. And of course, the error percentage when you take risk probably goes up and up and up as you go down the level in tennis. So I think that's something to study for sure. So, who could we study for really high percentage tennis? Novak Djokovic, as you said. He is great at his directionals. He has lots of cross-court shots. When he steps in to change direction, it's very often when he's inside the baseline. Pretty much everything else is cross or down the middle. And the players, the pros use the down the middle more than you think. Not everything is necessarily out to a corner or a side. They will use that middle third of the court, but they'll keep it deep, they'll keep it high. So these are, I think one thing you can look to do is study where the ball lands in many of these things. Now, once you understand that level, okay, who could we study for being a little bit more aggressive? Especially off the forehand. I would say Roger Federer would be a good one to understand. He's got obviously great forehand, and he's great with the inside-out piece and being able to manage the court that way. When Rafael Nadal is dominating a point, he's another good guy if you're left-handed to see how he works that, cross-court forehand into a righty's backhand, how he moves his feet to hit a lot of inside-out forehands. So I think, again, breaking it down into some of the component parts that you want to get into in terms of decision-making. All right, when should I change direction? When should I be aggressive? And you're trying to work this into how you play the game, how you want to play the game. If you like David Ferrer and you want to be a grinder like that, okay, you study that game a little bit more because it is a very high percentage. One thing you brought up, Josh, is footwork. To be a great pro, and this is something that Andy Roddick mentioned, to be a great pro, and he was comparing elite college players to elite pros and saying there were two differences: consistency and footwork. So, no matter what your level is, working on your feet, your speed, your agility, your ability to be balanced, getting to the ball will absolutely help your game and will help make you more consistent as well. So, when you watch a guy like Federer, he's not 100% aggressive all the time. He he understands when to be aggressive, like this is a ball I can be aggressive on and I'm gonna do it. And then if he's, in a more neutral rally and he has to be neutral, then he's neutral. So it's like that understanding of, all right, this is a ball where I could be, or this is a ball where I simply need to go cross and try to do a little bit of damage with it. And so decision making, I agree with you, is really huge. And I worry that a lot of players don't learn that. They learn skills. They learn how to hit the forehand and the backhand, but they're not learning actually how to play the game so much. And if we could study that from the pros, just like, you know, people who are, grandmasters in chess, they study openings, they study defenses. And if we could be looking at it that way more, then I think there's a lot of value in seeing the way these pros play and why, pros that you like and getting some information from that.
Definitely, definitely. And yeah, I think there's a lot that people can do to, and I think we can, and I love chess, and I play a lot on my phone, play a lot of bullet chess, blitz chess, quick games, and I think, and I don't do that much studying of the openings, the end games, that sort of thing, and I think you can make a pretty good comparison to tennis, to a tennis point, right? The opening, right? What does that serve and return look like? How are the best in the world so effective at it? How do the best servers in the world hold 90+% of the time? What do they do well? What are they avoiding doing, right? How often do they actually double fault? And then we compare that to the average club player. What percent of their first serves do they make? Most pros are somewhere between 60 to 70% of their first serves that they make. Most club players are not. I would venture to say, maybe you agree or disagree here, Brian. I think most club players are probably somewhere around 50, maybe even a little lower.
Mm-hmm.
Um, so if you making under less than 50% of your first serves, you're relying on your second serve. And I don't think that's where you want to be. Again, we talk about the pros. Most pros aren't winning more than 50% of their second serves. And definitely most club players aren't. So now on our service game, when we're expected to win that game, right? We're relying on a second serve where we're probably less than 50% chance of winning that point. The numbers don't really work out that way. So I think you can take a look at the numbers, and there's, as we've talked about, Craig O'Shaughnessy, there's some great data from him out there. I've been to some presentations that he's done that are really excellent. And just understanding the game, being a student of the game, understanding the openings, right? The serve and return, understanding how pros finish points, right? Again, talking about Craig, he talks about the use of the forehand. He breaks down the court into A, B, C, and D, sort of like A being the left side of the left half of the deuce side. B being the right half of the deuce side towards the center. C being the left half of the ad side. D being the right half of the ad side. And talks about different patterns using your forehand where you can really dominate the court. Open up the court, and then where you want to finish the point. But noticing, where do pros finish to, right? Djokovic using the down the line backhand, Federer using the inside out forehand, Nadal using his forehand, whoever it may be. Serena's swinging volley and forehand. So whatever it is, but noticing also those end games, or those how the pros finish points, I think. And yeah, being a student of the game and noticing how they're successful. And that might be how points finish, how points end, what takes place before or between points, what takes place during the warm up, and just trying to notice these details about pros, and then you start to gain clues into why they are as successful as they are.
Yeah, and I guess the part I would wrap up on, Josh, is like when you do decide to do this stuff, act as if you're that player. That's a really powerful way when you play a role in a way. Be that player for this particular thing, because it gives you a model again to work toward, and that's really powerful. And there's research on when you do that, you generally have better performances. So I think professionalism, studying the game, between points, decision making, there's a lot of stuff here for players to look at. So good conversation. So that was a good question. So that's our show for today. Thank you for listening. For more on today's episode, please check out the show notes. If you have any feedback for Josh and me, email us at tennisiqpodcast@gmail.com. You can also use the Twitter hashtag tennisiq. Additionally, please subscribe to the show on your podcast platform of choice, including YouTube, so you can be notified of new episodes. You can also check us out on Instagram. If you'd like to support the podcast, please visit our Patreon page at patreon.com/tennisiq/membership. Thanks again, and we'll talk to you soon in our next episode.